the right to bear arms. It's enshrined in the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution, a seemingly unshakable pillar of American freedom. Yet the history of gun control in America tells a far different story, one marred by racial prejudice and a consistent effort to disarm marginalized communities. From the earliest days of the nation, the right to bear arms has been selectively applied, with discriminatory laws targeting Black Americans, Native Americans, and other minority groups. This video will explore this uncomfortable truth, delving into the racist roots of gun control and its continued impact on minority communities today. The narrative often peddled is that gun control is about safety, about keeping firearms out of the hands of those who would do harm. But a closer look reveals a far more sinister reality. Time and time again, gun control measures have been implemented not to protect, but to control, to strip away a fundamental right from those deemed a threat to the established order. This thought process is prevalent on the left in America. You know the people who are hiding behind their walls and armed guards while telling the citizens they can't own guns and that walls don't work. This pattern of discrimination is deeply woven into the fabric of American history, rearing its ugly head in various forms throughout the centuries. From the earliest colonial laws prohibiting slaves and Native Americans from owning guns to the Black Codes enacted after the Civil War, the intent was clear: to maintain a racial hierarchy by denying minorities the means to defend themselves. This pattern continued through the 20th century, with gun control measures disproportionately impacting Black and brown communities. The fight for true equality in America must include a recognition of this history, a dismantling of the racist structures that continue to permeate gun control legislation. The Second Amendment was meant to be a safeguard against tyranny, a guarantee that all citizens, regardless of race or creed, could protect themselves and their liberties. However, the reality has fallen far short of this ideal. The selective enforcement of gun rights, with minorities bearing the brunt of restrictive laws, stands as a stark reminder of the work that still needs to be done. Only by confronting this history and fighting for equal and just application of the law can we hope to create a society where the Second Amendment truly protects all Americans. The Reconstruction era, following the tumultuous years of the Civil War, saw a brief glimmer of hope for Black Americans newly freed from the shackles of slavery. However, this hope was soon met with fierce resistance in the form of Black Codes, a series of laws enacted across the South that aimed to maintain white supremacy and control over the newly emancipated population. These codes were a blatant attempt to circumvent the newly ratified 13th and 14th Amendments, effectively reinstituting many of the restrictions of slavery under the guise of law. One of the most insidious aspects of the Black Codes was the systematic disarmament of Black Americans. Recognizing the power of firearms in securing freedom and self-defense, Southern states run primarily by Democrats implemented laws that explicitly prohibited Black people from owning or carrying guns. These laws were not about public safety, they were about power. They were about ensuring that Black people remained vulnerable, unable to defend themselves against the violence and intimidation that permeated the post-Reconstruction South. This deliberate disarmament left Black communities at the mercy of white vigilante groups who were often the very same people who had previously held them in bondage. The Ku Klux Klan, born out of this era of racial terror, used violence and intimidation to enforce their white supremacist agenda, knowing that Black communities were largely defenseless. The message was clear. Freedom for Black Americans did not include the right to self-protection. The legacy of the Black Codes and the systematic disarmament of Black Americans continues to cast a long shadow on the issue of gun control today. The historical context cannot be ignored. The fight for gun rights for Black Americans is not merely about owning firearms. It is about reclaiming a fundamental right that was stripped away in a deliberate attempt to maintain a system of racial oppression. It is about ensuring that all Americans, regardless of the color of their skin, have the means to protect themselves and their loved ones from harm. The Second Amendment to the United States Constitution, ratified in 1791, declares that a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. These words, etched in the foundation of American governance, were intended to guarantee the right of all citizens to possess firearms for self-defense and as a bulwark against tyranny. Yet the history of the Second Amendment, much like the history of the nation itself, is one of broken promises and selective enforcement. For minority communities, the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to bear arms has often rung hollow. From the very beginning, this fundamental right was applied unevenly, with discriminatory laws specifically targeting Black Americans, Native Americans, and other minority groups. The stark reality is that the Second Amendment, while intended to protect the liberties of all Americans, has often been used as a tool to oppress and control those deemed undesirable by those in power. This selective enforcement of the Second Amendment is a stain on the fabric of American democracy. It undermines the very principles of equality and justice upon which the nation was founded. The right to self-defense is not a privilege reserved for a select few. It is an inherent right that should be enjoyed by all citizens, regardless of race, religion, or creed. The historical reality of gun control in America, however, paints a very different picture. The struggle for true equality in America must include a recognition of this historical injustice. It requires a dismantling of the racist structures that continue to permeate gun control legislation, and a commitment to ensuring that the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to bear arms is applied equally and justly to all Americans. Only then can we begin to heal the wounds of the past and create a future where the promise of liberty and justice for all is truly realized. As the promise of Reconstruction faded and the grip of Jim Crow tightened across the South, gun control laws emerged as a powerful tool to enforce racial segregation and maintain white supremacy. These laws, often disguised as measures to promote public safety, were strategically crafted and selectively enforced to target Black Americans, stripping them of their right to self-defense and leaving them vulnerable to violence and intimidation. The parallels between Jim Crow laws and gun control measures of this era are undeniable. Both were designed to restrict the freedoms of Black Americans, to relegate them to second-class citizenship. Poll taxes and literacy tests, used to disenfranchise Black voters, found their counterparts in prohibitive gun licensing fees and arbitrary enforcement of gun laws that disproportionately targeted Black gun owners. The message was clear. Black Americans were not to be trusted with the same rights and freedoms as their white counterparts. We need that the fundamental right to self-defense is applied equally and justly to all Americans. Pause 2S. The debate over gun control and minority rights extends far beyond the Jim Crow era, reaching into the very heart of constitutional interpretation. The Second Amendment of the United States Constitution clearly states that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This fundamental right is meant to apply universally, irrespective of race or background. However, history has shown us that this right has not always been equally protected. Laws that were ostensibly designed for public safety often disproportionately affected minority communities. These communities found themselves disarmed and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the freedoms enjoyed by their white counterparts. The passing of the 14th Amendment was a pivotal moment, intended to extend the protections of the Bill of Rights to all citizens, including the right to self-defense. In theory, this amendment should have dismantled any state-level restrictions on firearm ownership. The Constitution grants no power to the federal government to regulate or restrict firearm ownership in any way. And by extension, this power is also removed from the states. Despite these constitutional protections, the reality has often been different. It is ironic that the people who scream the loudest for gun control are the same ones that surround themselves with armed guards. Minority communities continue to face barriers that effectively limit their access to firearms, whether through economic means, bureaucratic hurdles, or selective enforcement of laws. This raises a critical question. If the Constitution bars any government from restricting gun ownership, why do these inequities persist? It is imperative to recognize that the struggle for equal rights, including the right to self-defense, is ongoing. The Constitution provides a clear mandate, but it is up to us to ensure that this mandate is applied justly and universally. Only then can we truly say that the right to keep and bear arms is a right enjoyed by all Americans, regardless of race or background. As we reflect on the historical context and contemporary implications of gun control laws, one thing becomes evident: the fight for equality and justice is far from over. We must remain vigilant to ensure that the rights enshrined in the Constitution are upheld for every citizen. In the end, the promise of the 14th Amendment and the Second Amendment is clear. It is our duty to ensure that these promises are kept, and that the right to self-defense is protected for all.